A climber is making their way up the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, somewhere above 8,000 meters. They are moving slowly. Everyone moves slowly up here, where the air contains roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and where every step requires a concentration of effort that flatland humans cannot easily imagine. Their breathing is loud inside their oxygen mask. Their fingers, despite the expedition grade gloves, are registering complaints that they are choosing to ignore because there is a summit above them. And they have spent years and a significant portion of their financial life getting to this point. And then they see him, sitting against a rock, dressed in clothing that is decades out of date, frozen in a posture that looks almost peaceful if you don't think too carefully about the context. A human being preserved by altitude and cold in a state of extraordinary completeness, who has been sitting in that exact position for longer than some of the climbers passing him have been alive. His face is visible. He looks like someone who sat down to rest and simply never stood back up, which is, with some elaboration, essentially what happened. The climber steps past him. They have been told to expect this. The guides have mentioned him by name because this particular individual has a name, has a story, has people who loved him who are still alive, and who think about him regularly. The climber nods in the way that people nod at things they don't have the cognitive resources to fully process while simultaneously managing their own survival at 8,500 meters, and keeps moving upward. This is not a rare occurrence. This is not a dramatic exception to the normal experience of climbing Mount Everest. There are currently somewhere between 200 and 300 human bodies on the mountain, distributed across its routes and faces, and most of them are never coming down. The mountain is effectively an open-air cemetery that people pay tens of thousands of dollars to walk through on their way to the summit. The question of why this is the case, why these bodies remain, why retrieval is so difficult, what attempts have been made, and what the ethics of this situation look like, is one of those questions that seems simple until you start pulling the threads, at which point it unravels into something considerably more complex and considerably more revealing about human capability, human physiology, and the particular character of the world above 8,000 meters. To understand why bodies remain on Everest, you first need to understand what the mountain actually does to human beings above 8,000 meters, what physiologists call the death zone, a name that was chosen with the blunt accuracy that altitude apparently inspires. Above 8,000 meters, the atmospheric pressure is approximately one-third of sea level pressure. This means every breath delivers approximately one-third of the oxygen that the same breath would deliver at sea level. The human body, at rest at altitude, is receiving oxygen at a rate that barely maintains basic physiological function. And climbing, which is the opposite of rest, increases oxygen demand dramatically at exactly the altitude where supply is most constrained. The consequences of this oxygen deprivation cascade through every system in the body. Cognitive function deteriorates, decisions become slower, judgment becomes impaired. The kind of clear-headed risk assessment that survival requires becomes progressively less available as altitude increases. Motor function deteriorates, coordination suffers, fine motor control diminishes. The precise footwork that technical climbing demands becomes increasingly unreliable. Core temperature regulation becomes more difficult to maintain. Pulmonary and cerebral edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs and brain, can develop rapidly and fatally even in well-acclimatized climbers who have been managing altitude well. Most commercially guided Everest climbs use supplemental oxygen above certain altitudes, which partially compensates for the atmospheric oxygen deficit. But supplemental oxygen systems can fail. Climbers sometimes miscalculate their usage rates and run out at critical moments. The benefit of supplemental oxygen, while real and significant, does not eliminate the physiological stress of extreme altitude. It reduces it to a level that most fit, acclimatized climbers can manage, most of the time under favorable conditions. The conditions on Mount Everest are not reliably favorable. Weather on the mountain can change with extraordinary speed. Clear skies can become life-threatening storms within hours. Wind speeds at the summit can exceed 100 miles per hour. Temperatures can drop to minus 60 degrees Celsius or below with wind chill factored in. The combination of hypoxia, cold, wind, and technical terrain creates a threat environment that tolerates almost no margin for error and provides almost no cushion when things go wrong. What kills people on Everest is usually a combination of these factors rather than a single cause. Exhaustion reducing the capacity to maintain body temperature, which leads to hypothermia, which further impairs judgment and motor function, which leads to falls or simply to lying down in a place where lying down means not getting back up. Altitude sickness developing faster than a descent can be organized, weather deteriorating and trapping climbers in exposure that their bodies cannot sustain, avalanche and rockfall, particularly on certain sections of the mountain's routes. Summit fever, the dangerous cognitive state in which summit obsession overrides rational assessment of deteriorating conditions, contributing to decision-making that turns manageable situations into fatal ones. When someone dies on Everest above 8,000 meters, the question of what happens next is determined almost entirely by the physics of the situation rather than by human preferences. A human body at altitude, in cold temperatures, is heavy. An average adult human body weighs between 60 and 90 kilograms, and dead weight, literally, is harder to manage than the same mass in a living person who can assist their own movement. Moving a dead body on steep technical terrain at altitude, where every person present is already operating at the margins of their own physiological capability, is an exercise in risk calculation that consistently produces the same answer. The risk to the living of moving the dead is too high. The physical mechanics of high-altitude body recovery have been demonstrated on the occasions when attempts have been made, and those demonstrations clarify why attempts are so rarely successful. Moving a body on the upper mountain typically requires anywhere from 6 to 12 people to lift, to belay, to manage the ropes, to secure the route. Each of those people is operating in an environment where their own survival is not guaranteed. A misstep while managing a heavy, awkward load on a slope above a fatal drop is not a recoverable situation. The physiological stress of extended high-altitude exertion while doing something as demanding as body recovery creates mortality risk for everyone involved. The cost of organized body recovery operations is also enormous. Professional high-altitude recovery teams, experienced Sherpa climbers undertaking the risk of recovery work, must be compensated at rates reflecting the danger involved. Helicopter operations at extreme altitude are at the edge of operational limits for the equipment. Helicopters cannot operate effectively above approximately 6,500 to 7,000 meters in most configurations, which means recovery from above that altitude requires human carrying rather than aerial extraction. A full organized body recovery operation from the upper mountain can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even when funded, can only be attempted during specific weather windows that may never materialize during a given season. The bodies that remain are therefore not there because nobody cares. They are there because the alternative, organized retrieval, presents a risk-cost calculation that regularly exceeds what can reasonably be justified, particularly for remains that have been on the mountain for years or decades and where immediate recovery is no longer relevant to any rescue concern. The preservation of human remains at extreme altitude produces one of the more uncanny features of the Everest body situation. Many of the dead are extraordinarily well preserved, in states that make them immediately recognizable as human beings rather than the kind of skeletal remains that most people associate with long-dead individuals. At temperatures consistently below freezing, biological decomposition essentially stops. The enzymes that drive cellular breakdown require liquid water and temperature ranges above freezing to function, and above a certain altitude on Everest, those conditions rarely exist. The bodies of climbers who died decades ago remain in states of preservation that can be disorienting for those who encounter them. Features recognizable, clothing still identifiable, postures suggesting recent death rather than decades of exposure. This preservation has made some of these individuals into landmarks. They have been given names by the climbing community. Their stories are known, their locations are referenced in route descriptions and expedition briefings. The most famous, green boots, named for the distinctive footwear on a climber who died in 1996 and whose body sheltered in a limestone cave along the Northeast Ridge Route, became so well known as a waypoint that his existence was simply incorporated into the operational reality of climbing that route. Green Boots' situation illustrates the particular strangeness of the Everest body landscape. A human being, once someone's child, colleague, partner, who died in pursuit of the same goal that thousands of people have pursued before and after, becomes a navigational landmark referenced matter-of-factly in route planning. The mountain's preservation function combined with the practical impossibility of removal creates a category of object that is simultaneously obviously human and practically treated as part of the terrain. The ethics of this situation generate ongoing discussion in the climbing community and beyond. The climbers who have become landmarks had families, identities, and presumably preferences about what would happen to their remains. Preferences that the mountain has overridden through sheer physical reality. Some families of climbers who died on Everest have expressed desire for the remains to stay where they are. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Finding a certain peace in knowing that their person remains on the mountain they loved. Others have wanted retrieval and have been frustrated by the practical impossibility of achieving it. The mountain's indifference to either preference is absolute. The 1996 disaster, in which 8 climbers died during a single storm, the events of which were subsequently documented in multiple books and films, brought the Everest death question to international public attention and generated both increased general awareness of the mountain's dangers and increased discussion of the body situation that the disaster illustrated. Several of the climbers who died in 1996 remain on the mountain. Rob Hall, the New Zealand guide who died near the south summit after spending a night out in the storm while attempting to assist a client, is still there. Scott Fisher, the American guide who died during the descent, is still there. Their deaths, and the deaths of others during that season, generated enormous media coverage and public engagement with the realities of high-altitude mountaineering that safety statistics alone had not produced. The aftermath of 1996 also generated increased scrutiny of the commercial Everest industry, the business of guiding paying clients to the summit who have varying levels of climbing experience and capability. Critics argued, and continue to argue, that the commercialization of Everest has increased the number of climbers above what the mountain's routes can safely accommodate, created conditions where inadequately experienced climbers are placed in life-threatening situations they are not equipped to manage, and generated the summit fever culture in which poor decision-making about turnaround times and deteriorating conditions contributes disproportionately to deaths. The counter-argument holds that commercial guiding has actually improved safety for many climbers by providing professional leadership, fixed ropes, supplemental oxygen management, and experienced Sherpa support that independent climbers lack. The death rate per summit attempt has not consistently increased with commercialization. It has fluctuated with weather patterns and seasonal conditions in ways that make simple narrative claims about commercialization's safety impacts difficult to sustain from the data. The Sherpa community's relationship to Everest's dead deserves particular consideration because it is Sherpas who have the most consistent, most dangerous, and most practically complex engagement with the mountain's body situation. Sherpas are the Tibetan Buddhist ethnic group native to the high-altitude regions of Nepal's Khumbu Valley whose cultural familiarity with extreme altitude and whose centuries of high-altitude agricultural and pastoral life have contributed to physiological adaptations, particularly in oxygen utilization efficiency, that make them extraordinarily capable at altitude. The modern Everest industry employs Sherpas as guides, load carriers, route fixers, and support staff. And Sherpa climbers have made extraordinary contributions to high-altitude mountaineering, including the first ascent by Tenzing Norgay alongside Edmund Hillary in 1953. Sherpas also die on Everest at rates that the international climbing community does not always adequately acknowledge. Sherpa deaths account for a significant proportion of total Everest fatalities, reflecting both the sheer number of high-altitude days Sherpa workers accumulate across careers and the particularly dangerous nature of certain tasks, particularly icefall travel on the Khumbu icefall, which must be crossed multiple times per expedition for load-carrying operations. When recovery operations are organized, when a family has resources to fund one, or when the Nepali government has directed one, or when a team of climbers decides to attempt bringing a body down, It is typically Sherpa climbers who undertake the physical work. The risk they accept in doing so is substantial and real. Several attempts to recover bodies from the upper mountain have been abandoned when conditions deteriorated, and in some cases, the recovery attempt itself has added names to the mountain's toll. Buddhist practice in the Sherpa community includes beliefs about the treatment of the dead and the importance of proper religious observance following death. The bodies left on the mountain represent, within this framework, individuals without the proper rites that their religious tradition considers important, a concern that generates distress in Sherpa communities even when the practical impossibility of retrieval is acknowledged. Lamas in the region perform prayers for those who have died on the mountain, providing what spiritual acknowledgement is possible from a distance. The Nepali government's relationship to Everest bodies is both bureaucratic and commercial, reflecting the mountain's status as Nepal's most significant tourism asset and source of permit revenue. Every climber on Everest pays a permit fee to the Nepali government, currently approximately $11,000 per person for the Nepal side routes. The total permit revenue from Everest expeditions represents a significant contribution to Nepal's economy, and the government's interest in managing the mountain's reputation and operational environment is therefore substantial. The growing public attention to the body situation and to related issues including human waste management and the accumulation of garbage on the mountain's routes has created pressure on Nepalese authorities to demonstrate more active management of conditions on the mountain. Recent regulations have attempted to address some of these concerns, including requirements that expedition teams bring back a certain quantity of waste from their climbs and increased enforcement of environmental management rules. The body situation is harder to regulate through permit conditions. Requiring expedition teams to remove any bodies they encounter would create a requirement that is both logistically impossible in many circumstances and potentially creates its own safety risks. Helicopter technology has improved significantly in recent years, and the operational ceiling for helicopter evacuations on Everest has increased. High-altitude helicopter rescues that would have been impossible with earlier technology are now sometimes achievable in favorable conditions. Several bodies that were previously considered unrecoverable have been brought down in recent years using improved helicopter capability, particularly from elevations where helicopter hover is possible and where conditions permitted the operation. These recoveries are still exceptional rather than routine. They require weather windows, helicopter capability, funding, and coordination that cannot be organized on short notice. But they represent a gradual expansion of what is practically possible that may, over time, change the calculus for at least some of the mountain's dead. The most discussed attempt at systematic body removal from Everest's upper reaches has been the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee's ongoing work, supported by various expedition teams and funded through combination of government support, expedition contributions, and international mountaineering organization involvement. This work has succeeded in removing remains and significant quantities of garbage from lower and middle elevations of the mountain, areas where access is more feasible and where the risk-cost calculation for removal teams is more favorable. The upper mountain, above approximately 8,000 meters, remains essentially beyond systematic organized recovery, though individual expeditions occasionally manage to bring down bodies or body parts they encounter under favorable conditions. The cleaning efforts have produced striking results in terms of garbage reduction on the lower mountain, and the organizational framework developed for garbage management provides a model that body recovery efforts can draw on. The infrastructure of high-altitude environmental management, trained teams, established protocols, operational experience in extreme altitude work, is developing in ways that may eventually enable more systematic approaches to the body situation. The philosophical dimension of the Everest body situation raises questions that transcend the practical recovery discussion and touch on what we owe the dead, what individuals accept when they attempt extreme undertakings, and what the mountain means as a space of human aspiration and human hubris. Most serious climbers who die on high mountains do so in pursuit of something they chose freely and valued highly. They were aware of the risks, perhaps not always in the granular detail that would fully inform their risk calculations, but aware in the general sense that high-altitude mountaineering is a domain where fatal outcomes are not rare. Many have made explicit peace with the possibility that their remains might remain on the mountain, and some have expressed preferences that they be left where they are if they die. The climbing community's relationship to the mountain's dead is one of respect complicated by necessity. Respect in the sense that the dead are acknowledged, remembered, named, and mourned. Complicated in the sense that the practical acknowledgement of their presence as waypoints and landmarks coexists with this respect in ways that can seem jarring to outside observers. The climber who steps past a frozen body while managing their own survival is not being callous. They are making the calculations that the mountain requires, which is exactly what the person now frozen there was doing when they were alive. The mountain imposes a particular relationship between the living and the dead that no other environment on Earth quite replicates. A relationship in which the dead are constantly present, often recognizable, sometimes named, occasionally useful as navigational references, and permanently resident in the space through which the living continue to pass. It is, depending on your perspective, either deeply disturbing or oddly appropriate that the mountain, which attracts people through the extreme nature of the challenge it represents, should also, through that extremity, make the consequences of that challenge permanently visible. The summit remains the goal. People will continue climbing Everest. The combination of challenge, prestige, personal meaning, and human ambition that draws people to the mountain has not diminished with increased knowledge of its dangers or with awareness of the bodies on its slopes. If anything, the mountain's reputation for consequence has become part of its appeal for the subset of humanity that finds challenge meaningful precisely because the stakes are real. Each season, new permit holders make their way through the Khumbu icefall, past the camps, up the fixed ropes, through the death zone, toward the summit. Each season, most of them return. Some do not. The mountain's ledger continues to be updated, new names added, new preservation beginning, new waypoints being formed that future climbers will step past with the particular combination of respect and functional necessity that the environment demands. The bodies left on Everest are not there because they were forgotten or because their lives were not valued. They are there because the mountain is hostile to human presence in ways that make the normal responses to death, recovery, proper burial, the physical rituals of mourning and closure, practically impossible without risking, adding to the number of bodies that need recovering. They are there because the mountain keeps what the mountain takes, and 200-odd times in the history of attempts on its summit, the mountain has taken something that it has not given back. The climber stepping past green boots, past the others, past the accumulated evidence of what the mountain costs. That climber is breathing through their mask, focused on their next step, managing the immediate imperatives of survival in the death zone. But somewhere beneath the focus and the hypoxia and the immediate physical demand, something registers. The presence of the dead at altitude does something to the living that flatland cemeteries, with their organized rows and their inscribed stones, do not do. It makes the living very aware that they are alive, and that the mountain is indifferent to whether that continues.